We are going to now move to the launch of our formal conference, and it's my absolute pleasure and delight to invite Professor Vidya Dehejia to get us launched on our two-day journey through the world of, as we dedicate ourselves to Rick's scholarship. Vidya Dehejia is Barbara Stoller Miller Professor Emeritus of Indian Art at Columbia University in New York, and author of her numerous books on the history of Indian art that connected the literary and visual arts in tremendously meaningful ways. I'm only going to speak of her most recent publications. You'll see even that is a long list. I begin with The Thief Who Stole My Heart. What a great title, right? The Material Life of Sacred Bronzes from Chola, India, which she published at the height of COVID in 2021. And it's not the only book she published in that year. She also published India, A Story Through 100 Objects in that same year. And we had a recent book reading by Indra from that project just 2 days ago. It was such a treat. In 2016, she published The Unfinished, Indian Stone Carvers at Work. And I also want to mention a personal favorite of mine, Body Adorned, in 2012. And in 2002, The Sensuous and the Sacred, Chola Bronzes from South India. Between 1994 and 2002, Vidya served as Chief Curator and Deputy Director of the Freer Galleries at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and was Acting Director in 2001. In 2016, she presented the 65th annual A.W. Mellon Lectures in the Fine Arts at the National Gallery in Washington, a series in which the art of India was featured for the very first time in the 65-year history of the Mellon Lectures. That's not the least of her honors, because in 2012 she was awarded a Padma Bhushan title by the Government of India for her outstanding contributions to art and education. Her talk today is titled, in honor of Rick, Epigraphy as Tool, the Earliest Chola Temples of the Sapta Sthala. Thank you, Vidya, and welcome.
It's a deep pleasure to be part of this celebration of Rick, who was much more than a colleague because he was also a very dear friend. And of course, I really am so sorry that Kathy wasn't able to be here. Her presence was always one of those one looked forward to. In fact, at every conference I went to, I'd say, what is Kathy going to be wearing tomorrow? Because she was always so impeccably turned out. Beautiful scarves, lovely jewelry, shoes, everything. I really miss her presence and, of course, Rick. Well, in 1985, Rick, together with G.S. Guy, edited a volume published by the AIIS titled Indian Epigraphy, its bearing on the history of art. 50 papers, short, succinct, but truly important for art historians. And it was the result of an AR previously at Varanasi. My review for the Journal of Asian Studies at that time ended with the comment that this was a book that would find itself on the shelf of any library interested in South Asia. And my paper today is offered as a tribute to Rick and his unerring sense of areas of significance in the field to which we have all devoted ourselves over these many years. Considering the fame and prominence of the Chola monarchs of South India and the distinguished reputation of their stone temples, their sculpted images, their sacred bronzes, it's surprising that the origin and early development of the Chola temple remains shrouded in ambiguity. The picture is so hazy that it has been possible for scholars to propose that temple building became a Chola royal priority only after Rajaraja came to the throne in 985, well over 100 years after the start of the dynasty. And as a corollary, it is suggested that the 9th century monarch Aditya Chola may not have built a single temple, despite a later copperplate inscription speaking of the many temples that he built. One of the main reasons for this uncertainty rests in the fact that during the period of Chola hegemony, it seems to have been the exception rather than the rule for any individual or group of individuals to lay claim to the construction of a temple. Even Rajaraja Chola did not leave a foundation inscription as such. Rather, there is just an inscription on the walls of the sanctum of his Tanjavur temple, and it issues a directive to the effect that gifts made by himself, his elder sister, his queens, and by others to the temple he has erected should be recorded on the stone walls of the temple itself. He doesn't claim glory for building this temple. It's almost in passing that he mentions his role in building the temple, Nam Yedupita, that I got constructed. And neither did his son Rajendra, who built the grand temple at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, leave a foundation inscription. In fact, it's only by way of Rajendra's Eshalam copper plate inscription that we know that he built that temple. There's certainly no shortage of inscriptions on any Chola temple. Like a richly textured mantle, inscriptions written largely in the Tamil script and language cover the exterior walls of the several hundred temples that dot the deltaic plains of the Kaveri River. It's difficult to quite comprehend the pervasiveness of this phenomenon, and so I will preface my talk itself with images from one single early Chola temple, which is Lalgudi's Saptarishishwara. Just look at the way those inscribed records flow seamlessly around those light projections and recesses on the temple walls. They're all over the base moldings, which you can't quite see until you see that they've been inserted into every available space. Inscriptions closely enclose these sculpted images. Here of Shiva as Veenadhara, inscriptions on both sides. Here of Ardhanari. Here of Bhikshatana. And in another early Chola temple, the Nageshwara at Kumbakonam, even grill windows carry inscriptions. The temple walls were used almost as if it was the public records office. And there are in the region of 13,000 inscriptions on temples built during the 4.5 centuries of Chola rule. My focus today is on a group of 7 finely proportioned stone temples of modest size along the banks of the Kaveri River and its tributaries, about between 7 to 13 kilometers north of Tanjavur, really close. These temples are at the junction of 2 routes, one east-west along the Kaveri River, the other running north from Tanjavur to Paruvur, which is the center of the Paruvettaraiyar chieftains, and then further north. The northernmost of these temples is at Ayaru, 5 rivers, and is known as the Panchanadishwara, Lord of the 5 rivers, the Kaveri itself and 4 of its tributaries, the Arishal, which unfortunately are not on this map, Arishalar, Vennar, Vettar and Kudumurutti. This cluster of 7 temples is celebrated to this day as a tightly related group in which the Ayaru temple's bronze processional image of Shiva as Chandrasekhara, together with Uma, not these images, but they would have been similar to these, is carried in procession to the other 6 temples. Today, this procession takes place on the 2nd day after the full moon of the month of Chitra, April-May, and follows an elliptical route from Ayaru. In sort of topographical sequence, the temples at Paranam, Chottuturai, Vedikudi, Kandiyur, Punturutti and Neithanam before returning to home base at Ayaru. Inscriptions in 2 of these temples suggest that this custom dates back 1,000 years. A record from Paranam speaks of an endowment of land, most likely in the year 983, for offerings in the temples of Paranam, Ayaru, Neithanam, Vedikudi, Punturutti, and 2 other temples whose names are damaged, presumably Chottuturai and Kandiyur. And then there's a second record of the year 1000 from the Chotuture temple, speaks of an endowment for sacred food to be prepared on the day of Vishakam in the month of Vaigashi, May, June, when the deity of Ayaru came to their village. Each of these temples of the sacred seven carry anywhere between 50 to 100 inscriptions, but none is a foundation inscription to tell us which chieftain or royal prince or queen or official or merchants or other group of individuals might have been responsible for their construction. Every one of the inscriptions speaks of gifts to an already functioning temple, of perpetual lamps, of sheep and goats to supply ghee for burning in those lamps, endowments for food offerings to the deity, land or gold for the celebration of temple festivals, gardens to supply flowers to adorn the deity, jewels to adorn temple bronzes. Regardless for the moment of the actual builder or builders of the temples of our early Septad, a scrutiny of the inscriptions that cover their walls reveals the close involvement of the Chola royal family with the maintenance and administrative running of these temples. Before I give you examples of such involvement, I want to emphasize that these 7 sites were already celebrated in songs by the Nayanmars, who composed their hymns roughly between 650 and 800. They were these sacred sites sung off by the saints, the Padal Petra Sthalam. In other words, structures of brick, combined probably, most likely, with wood, existed at these 7 villages. And it's interesting that the saints link 3 or 4 of these sites together in their verses as well. Appar, for instance, sings asking the Lord his original town and says, "What town do you really come from? Is it Turuti or Parnam or Naitanam?" Or again, Appar sings of Shiva as our light in Chotuturai, pure gem in Turuti, king of Parnam on the river, our rare gem in Alavai, which is not one of the sacred 7, sliver of moon in Naitanam. And when we look at that Tevaram collection of hymns, there are 6 hymns to Shiva of Naitanam, 6 at Paranam, 6 at Chotuturai, all of 18 to the Lord of Ayaru. You might notice that I've gone with the option presented by the Nayanmars themselves to drop that Tiru before their names. So instead of Tiruchotuture, Tiruturuti, Tiruparnam, in which any index would be loaded with the letter T, because everything has Tiru in front of it. But the Nayanmars themselves seem to have dropped it, so I've used that in my Thief Who Stole My Heart. So sometime in the latter half of the 9th century, it appears that these temples of brick and wood were converted into the stone structures that you see today. They are small, exquisite temples of the Ekatala, the single-story order. Perhaps this very fact of their conversion from brick to stone, as opposed to their brand new construction, explains why none has a foundation inscription. Perhaps no one claimed their construction because, after all, the temple already existed at the site, albeit in brick. And yet that doesn't apply universally, because Paruvettayar chieftain, whose temple at Kirai Paravur is sung off by Appar, it's one of those ancient temples, did claim to have erected a temple. But returning to the Sapta Sthala, the inscriptions do not reveal the identity of their founders. Even if you've got 101 at Chotuture, and Dr. Vijay Raghavan and his team are regularly unearthing more and more inscriptions on exterior walls and so on, surrounding walls. There are 400 and more inscriptions in the Sapta Sthala, and they only record the many donations made to this already existing and already functioning temple. So you might ask, why do I emphasize royal involvement in these temples? Because there is inscriptional evidence to that effect. And I will commence with two important inscriptions at the Netanam temple that speak of Aditya the First. The first inscription, which mentions Aditya Chola, who was hand in hand with Stanu Ravi of the Kerala monarch, the Chera monarch. It's an inscription that tells us how he gave, he bestowed a range of honors on his army general Vikki Annan. And the inscription is put on the walls of the temple, on the southern wall of the Ardhamandapa, more or less where I've tried to place it. And it's very clearly readable today. It commemorates that range of honors. Setting aside the question of whether or not Aditya was responsible for the construction of the temple, we can say that the sanctum and the Ardhamandapa of the temple was complete during his reign for such an inscription to be cut into the stone of the Ardhamandapa's south wall. We have a second inscription that is relevant, also cut into the south wall, this time of the shrine itself. And it tells us that Aditya's son Kannaradeva, he's one who died early, was interested in this temple in the year 8 of Rajakesari, which would be 878, 879 for Aditya. That inscription says that Adityan Kannaradeva, son of the ruling Chola king, gave gold to the temple for a Nonda Vilaku, which is a perpetually burning lamp, to illuminate the temple premises. And that prefix Adityan Kannaradeva is the standard, of course, Tamil way of giving the father's name, stating any individual's father's name. So clearly the shrine of the stone temple at Netanam, on whose south wall this inscription is engraved, was constructed prior to that date of 879. There's a third inscription, this time in the adjoining temple of Ayaru, which adds an interesting piece of information relevant to this issue. A woman named Kadamba Vitari identifies herself as the Tadi, the sort of foster mother is the only way I can think of putting it. She specifically identifies Kannaradeva as her charge, and she gives gold for a perpetually burning lamp in the Ayaru temple, which is known, it's about 2 miles at most north of Netanam, in the year 20 of Rajakesari, which would be 891 for Aditya. So, despite the absence of a dedicatory inscription, I find the fact of these 3 inscriptions to be strong pointers to the possibility that the Netanam temple was built with the blessings of Aditya Chola, if not by him. It's relevant also to mention that Adityapuram is the market town mentioned in the inscriptions at Netanam. And of course, it seems to me sort of very logical to assume that the temples erected during the early phase of attempted consolidation of a new monarchy would be located close to their temple, close to their capital. And these group of temples are within 7 to 13 kilometers north of the capital. A few words about Kannaradeva and his Tadi's many gifts of perpetually burning lamps. Gifts of lamps may sound like a petty matter, but they were not so. In fact, inscriptions prove that this is a burning issue in the Chola period. The interiors of temples are always dark, need illumination both day and night, and the evening when devotees do indeed go to the temples, lamps become a necessity for finding your way around the temple. And the gifts are for these Nonda Vilakas, perpetually burning lamps, that, as the inscriptions specify, will burn night and day, and thus they required a huge infusion of funds to ensure that adequate supply of ghee and oil to keep those wicks burning. And it's very interesting that half of the inscriptions in any early Chola period temple is for a donation either of lamps or of money to keep those lamps burning, usually by giving 90 goats to a shepherd who promises that in exchange he will give so much ghee every day to the temple. And so also interesting that the range of lamp donors comes from a very wide economic strata. We have lamps from a washerman, a vannan, a dhobi. And on the other hand, we have them from the chiefs of Tanjavur and Kottur. But back to the Sapta temples. The continuing participation of Chola princes in this group of 7 temples after the time of Aditya seems to me a further pointer to a royal association with this septad. And inscriptions reveal the involvement of 3 sons of Aditya's successor, Parantaka. The princes Arikula Kesari, Uttamashili, and Arinjaya. At the Naitanam temple, in the 24th year of Parantaka, and it's specifically him because he's got his title of Madurai Konda Koparakesari. So in the year 930, Prince Arikula Kesari, again, his name is preceded. It says Parantaka Arikula Kesari. So he's Parantaka's son. Gifted gold. The gold, incidentally, is specified to be Ilakashu or Sri Lankan money. That's another story. Which was entrusted to the town council to be used for, again, a perpetual lamp, as well as ghee to keep that lamp burning. You got a second son of Parantaka, Pillayar Uttamashili, who gave a gift of gold and land for a perpetually burning lamp, now this time to the temple of Kandiur. And then you have Prince Arinjaya, Parantaka Arinjaya, similarly gifting gold for a lamp to the temple at Punturuti, as well as ghee to keep it burning. And then there's a final gift of interest, which we find in the temple at Paranam. It comes from Pandan Kali, who calls herself the Dadi of Parantaka himself, foster mother of Parantaka. Her gift to Paranam is made in Parantaka's 13th year, 918, and was to be used to feed 10 Brahmins daily, also to pay expenses of temple cooks and potters and other servants. So these 3 gifts to 3 temples of the septad from 3 royal princes during the reign of their father Parantaka, plus the Tadi, Parantaka's Tadi's gifts, suggest to me that there is a royal relationship with family temples. A case has been made to the effect that Chola queens should be considered in terms of their natal families rather than that of the Chola line into which they entered. That argument is strong and it's convincing in the cases in which it has been cited, but I think we may overstate it if we want to expand it too much. Because inscriptions from this group of 7 temples suggests that the chieftains' daughters, the princesses who entered into these marital alliances with the Chola royal family and their mothers display an equal allegiance to the family with which they are forging this marital alliance, in other words, the Cholas. There are many inscriptions. If you read just the top one, for instance, Vairyakan Tribhuvana Mahadevi, Queen of Arajakesari, gave a gift to Punturuti, her mother, Kadupattigal Tamaramettiyar, and it says in the actual inscription, mother of such so-and-so. So-and-so gives a gift to Chotruturai and to Paranam. And so it goes on. If you look all the way down, the mothers of these queens, the queens and their mothers, keep giving gifts to these temples, suggesting that they did want to establish an association of influence with the family that they had entered through this marital alliance. Another set of inscriptions that I'd like to bring into the picture to investigate possible royal involvement in this septad of temples involves the Bhogiyar, the concubines, for the moment, for loss of a better word, of the Chola kings. And we have inscriptions at Punturuti and at Naitanam speaking about the gifts of these Bogiars. What does a gift from a Bogiar, does the involvement of a Bogiar in a temple indicate that their royal lords were involved? Maybe and maybe not. So I'll leave that one right there. A final category, I think the significant category of stakeholders in this septad of temples are the Shrikaryam officers, the sacred works officers, who were in charge of overseeing temple administration, and their role included checking the accounts of the temples, levying fines when it was deemed appropriate. And from the phraseology involved in some of the inscriptions, at least in the very first one that you see, it seems that they received sanction to do so from the king himself, because as you can see, it says the Shrimukham of Parant, that is the personal involvement of Parantaka himself. If you look at that last inscription, the lowest ones here, you see one of these officers, Minavan Bilattur Natikon. Kon means a king, so you're getting a titled officer, a Shrikaryam officer. You find him at Netanam, you see him in 990 at Vedikuri, making arrangements, you see him at Chotuture in 991, investigating lamp service with Rajaraja's blessings, you see him at Chotuture, investigating food offerings and levying fines. It's an interesting group of official involvement, it seems. Now, what about the chieftains? Approximately 20 out of 400 records are from chieftains, 5% of the total. They are either Velans, they are Arayans, Mut Arayans, Paruvet Arayans, Pallav Arayans, they are those chieftains. So approximately 20 out of the 400 records in these 7 temples in the septad. So, considering the various inscriptional records together, I propose that this cluster of 7 temples was rebuilt in stone during the reign of Aditya I, and that they owe their current appearance, when the original survives, to work done towards the end of the 3rd quarter of the 9th century. Not a single inscription carries a clear statement about the builders of these temples. But I feel that the inscriptions of Aditya's own sons of three sons of his successor, of the many queens and mothers-in-law of the rulers, and the temple's Shrikaryam officer all emphasize a degree of royal involvement in this group of temples. You know, there's a crucial question about temple building during the Chola period of 4.5 centuries that we've all bypassed, but it demands acknowledgement once you start examining the inscriptions. If you use Mahalingam's 8 volumes of inscriptions of the Tamil country, and I'm taking just the Tanjavur and Nagapattinam districts. This is the old Tanjavur single district, divided now today into Tanjavur and Nagapattinam. During 4.5 centuries of Chola rule, in those 2 districts of today, there are 220 temples. At 19 of those temples, we've got individuals who claim construction. That leaves us with 201 temples. So, okay, we have royalty building temples. We've got Champion Mahadevi, we've got Rajaraja's queen Danti Shakti, and then, of course, there are the 3 royal temples, Tanjavur, Darasuram, Tribhuvanam. If some of you wonder why Gangekonda Sholapuram isn't there, it's because it's not in either Tanjavur or Nagapattinam district. It's just South Arcot, just north of that. So, we're left to 187 temples. Who built them? It's why did no one claim construction? Why do the records at so many sites commence only with gifts to an already functioning temple? I like to return or focus on one of the temples for a few minutes. The inscriptions on the Vedikudi temple in particular emphasize the importance of the stonework that I've been talking about. They have been converted from brick and wood to stone. And the inscriptions on the temple repeatedly specify that it is a stone temple, Katrali, and then they say that we are cutting the inscription into the stone of this stone temple. So they repeat that word stone, several times. And the market town associated with Vedikudi is called Parakesaripuram, which is probably a reference to Parantaka. So one inscription speaks of the residents of Parakesaripuram deciding that the record should be cut into the stone of the stone temples. Katraliyil kalmel vettu. Another informs us that the officer of the stone temple of the Mahadeva of Parakesaripuram, as well as the town residents, ordered that the gift of Queen Vanavan Mahadevi should be cut into the stone of the stone temple. And the third inscription speaks, very interesting one, the Nagarata, the trading community of Parakesaripuram, as having installed the capstone of the stone temple, Mukatodu of the Katrali. And this repeated emphasis in these inscriptions on Vedikudi being a stone temple seems to me to indicate the importance that was assigned to converting pre-existing brick temples at a variety of sacred spots, these Padal Petrasthalams, into stone structures. So, by way of conclusion, let us return to the unbuilt copper plates of Sundara Chola and reconsider its statement about Aditya's temple building. What does it actually say? It speaks of Aditya by whom? The row of large temples of Shiva, as it were banners of his own victories, lofty and unacquainted with defeat, collapse, was built with stone on the two banks of the river Kaveri. And now we get to the hyperbole. From the Sahya mountains inhabited by lordly elephants, whose cheeks dripped with temple juice incessantly flowing, even to the ocean with the moon playing on the folds of its big restless waves. Now, royal copperplate charters are intended to glorify their monarchs. They are Mekirtis, they are panegyrics, they are poems of praise. That poet would not be popular if he didn't exaggerate a little bit. And because they contain that degree of hyperbole, they should be interpreted with considerable care. But my question here is whether it is proper to totally discard a statement as downright fabrication. Might we instead consider that the rebuilding in solid stone of a cluster of 7 earlier brick and wood temples along the Kaveri was in fact the basis for the hyperbolic statement about Aditya? And I'll leave it at that for your intervention.
Could you briefly talk a little bit about the way that they spoke about brick temples? If they spoke about the material of brick temples at all?
Very few inscriptions speak about that process. I think it's only Shembian Mahadevi who says, in the context of the inscriptions, that when they discarded, and it seems as if the inscriptions might have been on stone, actually, but that when she was when she was copying, having the inscriptions copied onto the stone temple, that every one was done, and that because they were no longer in useful in any way, they were then discarded. So they were discarding the old inscriptions after re-engraving them onto the stone of the stone temple. They don't speak about really at this stage of this conversion of brick and wood into stone. Later, we've got a few examples, even in Rajaraja's time, where they say that the temple it needs restoration, or that the stone steps have been walked on too much, they need restoration. There's even a Bana king who says that the brick of this old structure, much later inscriptions, is so worn out and gets the permission of the king to redo the whole thing. But at this particular stage and in these temples, frustratingly, there isn't an inscription which talks about it as literally being converted. So it's a tantalizing lack of information.
Would you care to speculate on whether thoughts of time itself changed from the movement from brick to stone?
That's an interesting thought. Would I care to speculate? We don't even know the extent to which that brick temple was actually completely a brick temple, or whether it was in the way of the Padal Petrasthalams during the saints' times. Many of them seem to have just been a small shelter over the Shivalinga, with brick around them, and there are a few stone pillars which seem to have belonged to earlier temples, which always seem to have been the door jambs into the sanctum, and some of them contain inscriptions of earlier ruler, and they seem to have removed those stone pieces and put them into the new temple. They don't seem to belong. But there's very scant evidence. It's very frustrating.
Yes. Can people hear, or would you like us to pass mics around?
I'll try to speak up.
Yeah.
This was fascinating. Thank you so much. I was really interested in the procession of the Shiva image going from
Ayaru all the way around.
The other ones. It reminded me of the Navatirupati and how on the Tamaraparani River you get the same set, you get a similar set of temples. It's like 9 Vaishnava temples where the saint goes to each of the temples. And so I was wondering about the connection between the songs of the saints, this image of Shiva, maybe even Aditya and identification with the god. I just wondered if you could say anything more about that ritual or the image that travels.
I really don't think that we know very much more. We've got just these. I've picked out. I mean, spending time with those 400 inscriptions and going through them very, very carefully. I guess we can speculate, and why those 7 that were obviously. Even for the saints, they are grouping them in different little groupings, but it's those groups. Of course, the saints sing of various other sites, but these 7 sites, it's sort of, these inscriptions are in South Indian Inscriptions Volume 4, which just hasn't been touched. It's one of those many volumes which was never translated, annotated. There's no short little summary. There's nothing in English. So it's just been there, and that volume 4 hasn't been looked at all. Mm-hmm. And seeing these temples so close, I mean, you could almost walk, if you were a good walker, from Tanjavur to at least one of the temples. 7 kilometers is perfectly possible. And that whole cycle is also possible for, I mean, if you're going to walk around other sacred mountains, this is a sort of a possibility to walk. There's very, very little information. And they haven't been, they are called the Sapta Sthalas, but there isn't a clear, we don't even know exactly when that started. it's all a bit of pulling some inscriptions together, examining every inscription in those temples, and then you see the repetition of these gifts to those one or other of the seven, and it's sort of pulling it together from there. And I agree that I have previously certainly overdone the emphasis on royalty, but coming back to it and looking at it again after several years, it seems to me that they were involved. To what degree they were involved, and then who built that temple. I mean, if you've got inscriptions of Aditya and Aditya's son, who might have been responsible? And then the tantalizing lack of evidence of who was responsible for all the other temples as well. Maddening.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am, for the talk. Actually, my question actually comes from the present day. Like, what is the public memory and behavior regarding this existence of this large amount of inscriptions within the temple structure? And
The large amount of?
inscriptions within the temple structure, and also what are what makes them to preserve them. It's wonderful to see the inscriptions being intact even today in your images. Like, you don't find any scribbling next to them, which is poor after, like, in today present times. So what is their public memory that is making them preserve this? What is their perception towards these inscriptions?
They are completely ignored by the worshipper, obviously. They're not interested in the inscriptions at all. And watching me and my colleague Marcia Gandhi sitting on the ground and photographing or doing this, they would all come and say, "What are you looking at?" And we'd say the inscription. And they said, "Oh, and what does the inscription say?" So there is complete lack of any memory about the inscriptions, and they have been neglected in places where they are doing sandblasting. The inscriptions are less and less legible. They are still there. In some places they're gone. The HRNC, the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments people, give out what they call these tripanis, which is the permission to renovate. And they give it out very readily without asking any questions. And because we have the South Indian inscriptions volumes at Tiruvire Maradur, there were 159 inscriptions which were recorded in something like 1912, 1914. We've got a complete list, and it's fantastic information in those inscriptions, including that one of the later rulers, Vikrama Chola, was particularly interested in that temple and so on. Now, when I went to the temple, it completely renovated. They've taken down the walls completely. So there's not one of those 159 inscriptions intact anymore in that case. So it's frustrating because you walk around the temple and you can see the darn things right there. And I also wonder about that nature of, it's almost decorative in its own way, but it has been completely ignored and neglected. The priests don't know what it says at all, nor can, it's Tamil, but that is earlier Tamil, it's not today's Tamil.
And the script is Grantha, right?
No, it's Tamil.
Oh, just Tamil script?
It is Tamil script. But it's sort of slightly earlier Tamil. But the Ma is the Ma and the Ka is the Ka and, Ra is Ra and that sort of thing. But it's slightly earlier.
May I follow up on your wonderful question? And you are? If you can introduce yourself, you're all small group. Yeah.
My name is Ajay Salinte. I'm a doctoral student in IIT.
Wonderful.
Terrific.
So I wanted to follow up as well, with the question coming from the present. Vidya, as you know, I'm a colonial historian, and my current work is really looking at acts of gifting actually for education in British India. And I've gotten very interested. I wanted to pick up on this, I want to connect the act of writing, the act of inscribing on stone with the act of gifting, which is another theme that's running through this, right? A couple of weeks ago, I was wandering around Delhi College, the old Delhi College, because I was in search of a little marble tablet which apparently recorded in 1829 there was a gift of 1,70,000 rupees.
Lot in those days.
There was a huge amount in those days by a Nawab of Lucknow called Itmad-ud-Dawla for the college. And there's been some amount written about this. The British, of course, made a big deal about the fact that they put up this marble tablet. So I went off in search of this marble tablet. And I had to really look for it. It was perched all the way at the top. It's in the Ghaziuddin Madrasa. And all the way at the top where nobody could have even seen it. But the impulse, right, to record it, inscribe it in stone, this is, of course, in Persian, and all of that, I've been reflecting on it. And your talk is really making me think about it even more. So first of all, thank you for that. But the question is, when I have been thinking, and there's similar things going on in every other place, the Pachepa College, which is another college that I'm tracking, again, the fact that you need to put up, an inscription marking the donation. Same, in other places, right? In Hindu college in Calcutta, everywhere. So are these being done with an eye to the future? So could we make an argument? Do you think that these Chola actors that you're looking at have an eye to the future when they're doing this act? And of course, as you pointed out in this discussion, in the future it's being ignored, right? So it's sort of an hope that in the future people will remember, because in their own times they couldn't have expected people to read this, right? Given rates of literacy. So who was reading it in their time as opposed to... My sense is it was for the future, but maybe, I'd love for you to hear.
I think that a number of these inscriptions are recording gifts. So we've also got, there are inscriptions which say that so-and-so, I think one of these earlier inscriptions, if I don't know whether it's worth going back, one of the queens, no, it was... one of the Bogiars, right in the center. So a Bogiar gives a gift of gold to Netanam. It's meant for a lamp. And the temple authorities use it instead to build a Namana Mandapa, a bathing hall for the bronze images. And then the king intervenes when he finds that that's been done, and he donates the land to fulfill his Bogiar's original intention. So in a manner of speaking, it's a way of record keeping for the temple itself. You've recorded it there, and if there is a dispute about something, you can literally go to the temple walls itself. There's another couple of things I'd like to say on that. Starting with the fact of the words used for, so the person who's actually in charge of engraving all of these is he's not called a stone engraver, but he's called a palm leaf Nayakan.
Oh, so the stylus is so different.
So it seems as if all of this was also recorded in some proper office somewhere. Maybe they realized that Palmyra palm is going to be very fragile, is not going to last. And every one of them is also seems to, I think, was recorded on the temple walls itself. So there's that bit of it.
So it's an archive. So it's a sense also of an archive, right? Which also, the scholarship of archives suggests that there's an idea of the future.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Recording the past in the present.
In the immediate future, in the Chola future, let's say, or in the next few generations or the next 200 to 300 years. Another interesting point is that these inscriptions, they did want somebody, the Shrikaryam officer maybe, to be able to read them. Because particularly at Paranam, I found 2 or 3 inscriptions, they're fascinating, which says that here is so it says, it says that all the instructions about how this festival should be conducted are contained in two places. So it tells you first that it is contained on the Podige, the Jagati, and the Kumudam of the base moldings. And then it says that the rest of it will be found on the just below the eave and on the Virkandam and on those portions of it. So they are actually directing you. It's like a footnote system almost, that they're telling you where to look. And I've come across more and more of these recently, where it says, and this inscription is continued in such and such a place. So they seem to want the inscriptions to be read, presumably only by, I don't know, the Shrikaryam officers, or by the priests who might have been able to read it.
Successors, because they're often also ensuring that the gift is not destroyed, right? That people perpetuate the gift. It's just a question of the addressee is interesting.
And then there's yet another problem about inscriptions, which is that I in my Thief Who Stole My Heart, have got a whole section on the Nageshwara temple at Kumbakonam. And what I did was to color code it so that you could see the earliest inscriptions are green, then the next one is red, and and you find that so you've got a blank temple, and your first inscription happens to be along the base molding, and in the reign of the same ruler, he doesn't continue along the next inscription. He's gone to the back of the temple, and then he's gone to that side of the temple. Why would they do something like that? It's very intriguing, and I have no answer for it. I've just pointed it out that it is that way. And also, of course, it's got nothing to do with worship itself. So it's not meant for worship. So you've got 3 levels of base moldings, and you start at that end. So your circumambulation, if this is the wall of the temple, circumambulation this way, you're beginning, you can't read it backwards from here. So you've got to go there and then read it all this way. Then there's another line, you've got to walk back there and you read it that way. So it's got nothing to do with the general public consumption of the inscriptions. It is intended for some other type of audience, some record keeping of sorts.
There also seems to be like an anxiety over empty space, no? To cover up everything with an inscription or a requiem, right? Possibly. Yeah, Shaman, please.
Sorry. Just thank you for the wonderful lecture. Just to follow up on Smriti's point about the internet audience, and I was wondering whether one could also think about the larger general consciousness about material hierarchy involved in the stone inscriptions. I mean, clearly the inscribers are called the palm leaf scribes. If they are called palm leaf scribes, is there a larger point that can be made about material hierarchy of the stone inscriptions, particularly to the direction that often these inscriptions are meant to be seen even without reading? That's all. Thank you.
They carry authority in a way. Yes, that is certainly true also. It's just fascinating that they would do it so. You see, because the Pallavas before them didn't do this. They did not cover their temple site. Neither did Vijayanagara. Of course, there are inscriptions, but they didn't cover every bit. So, following one temple's things, again, it's the Nageshwara at Kumbakonam. So you've got Parantaka, and then you get to Raja, and then Rajendra's inscription. It's every bit is finished. So then Rajendra's inscription has to go on the Prakara wall that surrounds it, and then later inscriptions go. There's no place left on these main things. So
they build more temples. Maybe that's the reason for building these temples, because they need space to write.
It is extraordinary.
Out of paper.
Out of paper, exactly. They're out of temples, fresh out of, it's really
Out of palmyra leaf.
No, it's fascinating to think about this, right?
Ole Nayakan is the word they use for the.
Ole Nayakan.
Ole is the palm leaf, and the lord of the, or the chief of the, is the person who is inscribing. That's the title given to him, which suggests that the Ole, of course, is first. The palm leaf is the first one, and then he becomes, when they start inscribing on stone, he's called the Ole Nayakan, one who knows how to write, I guess it
Still
means.
hold that even though he's writing on kal.
Yes, even though he's writing on Katralil Kalmel Vettu. But he's the Ole Nayakan.
Yes, and your name, please?
Shashik. My name is Shashik. I'm a PhD student at University of Pennsylvania, South Asia Studies Department.
Welcome, Sashi.
Hi. Placement of inscriptions, again, continuing with that conversation. What it looks like to me is that there is no framing to these inscriptions, right?
Correct.
Like in today's day temple, if you go, there is a separate framing, separate stone even in fact is used, separate setting within temple, very clear sort of calligraphy. So you know where to look for if you want to find donors' names or who built it, construction, architecture, whatever. In these inscriptions, I don't see anything like that. So there is an interest in inscriptions. There is so much going on, so many people continuing and finding different places within temple, but there is no framing at all.
No
So
framing.
What can we make of that?
I don't know what to make of it. I'd like to present it to you. So, when you look at something like this for the first time, it helps very much when you go to Mysuru to the epigraphical survey, and they give you this sort of very irregular piece of paper, because when they made the rubbings of the temple walls, the people who made the rubbings were the people who sort of produced the handwritten copies. So they have organized it. So it's possible that one inscription will be a piece like this, and then this could be continued up there, and so you get these weird shapes of long pieces of these rubbings that you open up, and you put them on the floor on one side and you roll them out up to there, and then the next piece comes there, and it's amazing that they did not bother, even though they're telling you that this is continued there and you go to this place to find it, and yet they did not make it clear where. So you've got to, even those who can read this readily on the temple walls have to stop and sort of say, okay, now where does this continue? It is an interesting question.
And of course, absence of punctuation, which we as modern readers are so used to, right? Go back and look at that.
And very
remember
often
that.
when there are sculptures, say if this is a sculpture, things will come all the
Yeah.
way down like this,
Yeah.
and then they might continue on there, but then there might be an earlier inscription here, so then it will go that way and skirt around.
Yes,
So
it's
you can
quite
have the most
fascinating.
incredible documentation, and then you wonder, it raises more questions than it
Absolutely.
answers in a way.
Yeah, but writing
About
its surface.
It's like a challenge to reader.
Yes, very much.
It is a challenge. Those Srikaryam officers who might have been settling disputes, we've got inscriptions of that sort about them settling disputes about so-and-so gave money for such and such purpose, and then the Srikaryam officer is called in because that woman complains to him to say my gift wasn't honored, and he finds the sons of the original person, and then he finds them and says, you will carry out this gift. So they are reading it, but otherwise it's a real question.
We have three more questions and
Mine's
10 minutes.
very
Yeah,
brief.
please, Sarah.
Is there any indication of them erasing or writing over in script?
No, not much. There may be one or two instances, but generally they seem to have been very clear about what they were going to do.
Well, there are errors too, right? I remember from my
There
early
can be
epigraphy
grammatical
classes.
sometimes,
Yeah,
little things, but not significant enough.
enough to make it. Interesting. Yes, and your name, please?
Hi, my name is Nandy. I'm from Brown University pursuing a PhD. And I was just wondering, actually, since some of the inscriptions are scattered in a way, they're not linear. I was just wondering, were they done before the construction, the slabs on the rocks, or were they done after the entire temple?
On the temple, because they go over and around a projection. They go around and a sculpted image. It's definitely after construction. The way in which they have been. I mean, when you look at something like the space molding, it's incredible that they would use this sort of a space to add the gifts. And it's all gifting.
Yeah, but not, the figures, right? Like, they don't inscribe, writing doesn't
No.
go on the figures, the human or the non-human.
You're right.
Right?
It goes around them.
It goes around them, which is
Yeah.
also very interesting to think about, that they, recognize that as not a surface.
Well, it
that
would
they
be
should
damn
cover.
difficult to even engrave on it, even to write on it, because it's
Possibly, yeah.
curved and things.
Interesting.
And it's important.
Yeah,
It's beautiful.
interesting, yeah.
Rebecca, so I just had a comment coming off of this
Terrific
conversation.
comments on you.
Comment and question, I don't know. But it was striking to me, this writing on all of the base moldings, and it seems like there's, especially in so many other traditions, I'm thinking here of Islamic inscriptions, for example, where there are experts, right, who plan out exactly how long the calligraphy must be and space it out, and they have all of this forethought and planning, and there's clearly forethought here, but it doesn't, it's like there's some things are emphasized, like the record keeping, the archive, the meaning of the text has to sort of be present, but there are certain kind of aesthetic and spatial, not all, but certain aesthetic and spatial aspects that other traditions very much value that are not valued here at all. So, thinking about the borders that you were talking about, that sort of having a frame for it, or making sure that one inscription is in the same place, or at least around the same doorway or something. So there seems to be a kind of spatial, and I don't want to frame this as a lack, but sort of really
Disregard.
a fascinating sort of, this is not something they care about, and that is interesting to me.
Yeah.
That there's a kind of, so therefore what it means is, going back to the archive question, that there's something about the meaning of the text itself, and not the visual aspect of the calligraphy, or the spacing on the temple, or the relation to the body when you're reading it. Like, they don't seem to care about any of those things. It's much more about the record itself.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, the contrast with Islamic calligraphy is huge.
Right.
But then there also, I mean, it is most of the time a passage from the Quran or something like that.
So it's sacred text
Allah
itself.
and Ali and words like that, which have meaning in their own, and they are repetitive. They can be repetitive.
Yeah.
They express
Yeah.
the religious fervor. The religious fervor here is only in that they've given a gift for a lamp which is going to burn continuously.
Yeah.
But the details that are given are terribly mundane. So and so shepherd has given so many goats to, and he has promised, and it could be. And everyone, the only thing that refers to anything about the sacred is that every one of the inscriptions ends by saying Pan Maheshwara Rakshay, which is that this is given in safekeeping, Raksha, and protection of the temple priests. So that's the last phrase of every inscription. So that's the only thing that is referring to the sacred. Otherwise, it's mundane. How many buffaloes and how many cows and where they are to be staying and how many ladles of milk and etc. And it's sort of very mundane.
Yeah. It's like the mundanity and the surface. It sort of doesn't matter where it goes. Like on some level, it's sort of apparently that was less.
Apparently,
Yeah.
it's incredible, but
It's fascinating. It's fascinating.
But it
Yeah.
does remind me.
Deborah, yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say, sorry. It does remind me of. I was thinking of Islamic talismanic things where they
Mhm.
write and they cover
Surface.
every surface in that way. And so that what you said about that end, there is something really visually captivating about it. That it does feel maybe like talismanic.
Yes, I must say that it is captivating. If the stuff was clean, it really would be captivating. It's gone out.
Oh, it's good. Yeah. But you know, just a last follow up, and we are out of. It's so fantastic, right? Because we want to give plenty of space for this kind of discussion. You know, I'm very struck. You know, building on all these wonderful comments, the fact that the Olai icon on the palm leaf is now transiting to another medium. So I wonder if there's something about the technology of how they did these olais, right? And they were precious. They had to cover all that surface. And then they moved to the stone and they may be carrying that over, possibly. And, you know, the way they, I wonder if that has to be also, you know, brought into the argument, you know, to think about Ole Nayakan at this time and how he was using
Yeah, I
the
think
palm
I
leaf.
think you could possibly say that the palm leaf is written first,
Yes.
and it is recorded here next.
Right.
And the reason I say that is that this temple, for instance, Nageshwara, but at all the temple, it says that on such and such a temple in such and such a district on the north bank of the Kaveri and on such and such a thing, this gift was given. And every one of them repeats it, and it's right on the temple. You don't need to say in such and such a district, on such and such a temple of the Lord of such and such. You don't need to repeat that 56 times or 156 times if you were only putting it on the temple. But if you were recording it somewhere else, and then you were
Copying
repeating it on the temple, and they are copying it as it was recorded there, rather than saying, well, we don't need this introduction. They're putting the introduction in.
So this is a backup, actually, of that
backup,
one.
that's right.
Yeah.
Photocopy.
And a permanent one, right? Because the palm leaf would, you know,
It's literally a hard drive.
Wish we had these. Well, we know the store also, you know. Thank you so much, Vidya, for getting us started on such a
Thank you.
wonderful note, and thanks to everybody for this great conversation.